My name is Henry Thompson, just a plain old man from a quiet little suburb outside Spokane, Washington. There's nothing flashy about my life, no Hollywood glamour, no grand adventure, but it's been filled with sleepless nights and long, bone-tiring days. I started young as a plumber, picking up odd jobs at a small local workshop. The pay was never much, but I always told myself, keep going for the kids. I have 3 children. My oldest Michael was always the bright one. Even as a boy, he dreamed of becoming an engineer. Sarah, my middle child, had a laugh that could light up a room and a passion for drawing that never left her. She later went on to study design. Then there's David, my youngest, mischievous but full of drive. He's now a young entrepreneur. Their mother Mary passed away far too soon, heart failure, when they were still little. That left me to raise them on my own. I remember those early mornings getting up at 4 a.m., brewing a strong pot of coffee and heading out before the sun rose, not coming home until it had long set. Some nights I picked up extra shifts just to afford Michael's college books. "Dad, I need a new textbook," he'd say, and I'd grin. "Then you'll get it. You just focus on learning, son." I gave up sleep, ignored the ache in my back from hauling pipes too heavy for one man, let my health quietly deteriorate, and never once complained. When Sarah got into that expensive art school, I sold my old car, the only one I had to pay her tuition, and buy her a bus pass. I still remember the day she hugged me, tears in her eyes, whispering, "You're the best dad in the world." And when David wanted to study in the UK, I borrowed money from friends, worked double shifts, and somehow sent him abroad. His letters were my reward. "You're my hero, Dad," he wrote once. Time passed. The kids grew up and found success. Michael is now the director of a construction firm, living in a sprawling house with his wife and children. Sarah married well and designs interiors for luxurious homes. David returned home to start a tech company. He drives a sleek, expensive car. I was proud, so proud. But slowly the calls started to fade. Their lives grew busy. Family dinners became rare, and I began to feel something I hadn't known before, tired, not just from age, but from a distance that kept growing between us. The last time Michael called it was rushed, half-hearted. Sarah sent a belated birthday text. David. He was overseas, too busy with meetings. His message read, "Now I sit alone in this little house looking out of the same window I used to watch them play beneath. I wonder, did I go wrong somewhere?" And then it came, the first sharp pain in my chest, strong enough to make me steady myself against the wall. Do they know, or have they forgotten the man who once gave them everything? I remember back when our house was filled with laughter, even without Mary, even when we only had pasta and tomato sauce on the table because the rest of the week's pay had gone to school supplies. Michael would tell me about his dream of building bridges, the biggest in the world. Sarah would show me her sketches, beaming with hope. And David, God, he'd crack the silliest jokes just to make me laugh. Even then, he was already dreaming of planes and foreign lands. I never saw myself as a hero, just a father who wanted better for his children. When Michael graduated high school, he looked around our tiny house and sighed, "Dad, I want a home of my own, for my future family. But how will I afford it?" I didn't hesitate. I sold the only thing left of my inheritance, a plot of land outside town that Mary had wanted to turn into a garden someday. $50,000. I handed it to Michael for his down payment. "I'll pay you back, Dad," he said, tears in his eyes. I smiled. "You don't have to. Just live a good life." Sarah's dream was costly. The art school in Seattle cost $20,000 a year, not counting dorm fees. I worked nights patching restaurant pipes until my hands were calloused and raw. She once called me, "Thrilled Dad, I won an award for my art." I sat in a cold kitchen, holding the phone close, and every ache in my body melted away. "Keep drawing," I told her. "That's all I need." David was the toughest. London wasn't cheap. Tuition, rent, food, it was all a mountain. "I promise I'll make you proud," he said. His eyes shone. I borrowed more, mortgaged the house, sent every penny I could. And the letters he sent, I kept them in a wooden box, read them over and over again like prayers. But things began to shift. After Michael got married, he visited less. One time he came by, glanced at my old plumbing tools stacked in the corner, and chuckled. "Dad, you still doing that? You should really retire. Looks kinda outdated." Sarah called less, and when she did, her voice sounded distant, laced with something polished and cold. "Dad, I'm slammed. Big project, can't talk now," she'd say, hanging up before I could answer. David rarely called. A short text now and then, "I'm fine. Don't worry." I told myself they were just busy building lives of their own, but then came that one rare family gathering. Sarah looked at me, then leaned toward Michael and whispered, "What is Dad even wearing? So out of touch." I heard it. My heart sank, but I told myself they didn't mean it. They're just caught up in the world. I still believed love would carry through, that the sacrifices I made would be remembered. But then the second pain came, sharper, heavier. And for the first time I feared something was changing forever. Time passed like wind sweeping across the open fields of Spokane, and my children, well, they grew up, each chasing their own bright and beautiful path. Michael's now the CEO of a major construction firm, living in a polished 3-story house with a manicured lawn, the same house I helped him put a down payment on. I still remember the day he showed me his glossy business card, his name printed in bold gold letters, Michael Thompson, CEO. He laughed. Dad, I made it, and I laughed with him, though deep down I couldn't help but wonder why he came around less and less. Sarah married a wealthy man in finance, settled into a luxury condo in downtown Seattle. She mailed me an elegant wedding invitation, but the last time we met, all she spoke about were her high-end interior design projects, name-dropping clients, and brands like I'd never understand her world anymore. David, the youngest, returned from London. After a few years, started his own tech company, always in a rush, always on the move. He drives a sleek car, now barely stands still. "Dad, I'm this close to signing a $1 million contract," he texted once, throwing in a winking emoji. But a phone call from him rarely lasted longer than 5 minutes. I was proud of them. God knows I was. Watching them succeed made every long night, every aching joint, every pipe I ever fixed worth it. But the pride never stood alone. It came with an empty feeling I couldn't quite name. The calls came only when they needed something. Michael phoned to ask for money, just a little more capital to scale the business, he said. "Just this once, Dad." Sarah wanted a few thousand to redecorate. Her husband was too busy. Could I help out David? Though he seldom called, always brought up a small loan to expand the company, and I always said yes, even as my wallet thinned. Even as cracks crept up the walls of my little house, still unrepaired. Family gatherings had become rare, like autumn leaves clinging to a tree. The last one was at Michael's home. I remember standing in his grand foyer feeling completely out of place. He was busy entertaining co-workers in tailored suits who barely looked my way. Sarah sat scrolling through her phone, only lighting up when her husband talked about their trip to Hawaii. David arrived late, apologizing because he'd just come from a meeting with investors. I tried to make conversation, told them about my day, something small about a job I did that week, but their eyes drifted. My words landed flat. "Dad, nobody fixes pipes like that anymore," David said with a chuckle, half joking, but it stung. That's when it hit me somewhere along the line I'd been quietly pushed to the edge. Like an old piece of furniture tucked into a forgotten corner. They still said they loved me, of course, but that love, it seemed tied to what I could still give. One cold afternoon, while crouched beneath a leaking pipe in the biting Spokane air, I felt a sharp pain seize my chest. I sat down, gasping hands trembling as I reached for my phone. My instinct was to call Michael or Sarah or David, but then I stopped. Would they pick up? Would they hear my voice and see a father in need, or just another task on their to-do list? The pain eventually eased, but another ache had started, deeper, quieter, and far harder to ignore. It was a bitter winter morning, the kind that cuts straight through your coat and into your bones. I was in the damp basement of a client's house wrestling with a stubborn pipe that refused to budge. Then all of a sudden my chest tightened like a vice. I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, gasping, clutching my chest. Sweat poured down my face despite the freezing air. The homeowner panicked and called an ambulance. Before I could make sense of what was happening, I was lying in a hospital bed at Spokane General, surrounded by the steady beep of monitors and the sharp sting of antiseptic in the air. The doctor told me I'd had a mild heart attack. "Mr. Thompson," he said, stern but concerned, "you've got to slow down. You're not 20 anymore." I nodded, but in my mind one thought kept spinning. How can I slow down when my kids still need me? Michael was the first I called. He lived the closest. "Dad, I'm swamped, but I'll be there soon," he said quickly before hanging up. Sarah texted, "You okay, Dad? I'm in a meeting. I'll stop by tonight." David, out in San Francisco, wrote, "Get some rest, Dad. I'll try to book a flight back." I stared up at the plain white ceiling, trying to shake the creeping feeling of loneliness. I understood they had lives, careers, families. I didn't expect them to drop everything. But the ache in my chest wasn't just from my heart, it was from something deeper, emptier. Michael arrived late in the afternoon, wearing a sleek grey suit, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes looked tired. Sarah came too dressed to the nines, though she barely looked up from her phone. "Dad, what did the doctor say?" Michael asked, glancing at his watch. I repeated the doctor's words, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'll need to take some time off. I'll figure out the hospital bill." Sarah finally looked up, frowning. "Dad, hospitals like this aren't cheap. How are you going to manage?" Her tone wasn't worried, it was sharp, almost accusatory. Michael added, "She's right. I mean, your work doesn't pay much anymore, and this place must cost a fortune." I gave them a weak smile, doing my best to hide the pain. "Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." But when the nurse came in to check my vitals, Michael and Sarah stepped out into the hallway. The door didn't shut all the way, and I heard them, clear as day. Michael's voice was low but firm. "Dad's becoming a burden. My company's already stretched. How am I supposed to keep covering his medical bills?" Sarah sighed. "And I can't keep running back and forth to the hospital either. My husband's been saying we should consider a care facility. It'd be more efficient." I closed my eyes hard. Something inside me clenched. A burden. That word echoed like a cruel bell in my chest. After all the years, after all the sleepless nights, all the money scraped together for tuition, for art supplies, for plane tickets and rent and down payments, was this what I had become? I wanted to call them back in. I wanted to ask, "Do you really see your father as a burden?" After everything I gave up, but I stayed silent. My hand clenched to the scratchy hospital blanket as I whispered to myself, maybe they were just frustrated, maybe they didn't mean it. But somewhere deep inside a crack had begun to form, and it was spreading. I stayed in the hospital for a few more days. The doctors prescribed a handful of pills and told me I needed complete rest. Michael and Sarah came back this time, wearing more concern on their faces, but I could tell it was just for show. "Dad, we've been thinking," Michael said, his voice steady, businesslike. "It's probably best if we move you into a care facility, somewhere you can be looked after properly. Full-time nurses, round-the-clock care. You won't have to worry about a thing." Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes, Dad. I did some research. There's a place just outside Spokane, Sunny Meadows. It's clean and quiet. We'll cover the monthly fees." I looked at them, wanting to say no, wanting to remind them I still had a home, that I could take care of myself, but then came that familiar pain in my chest, reminding me that old age doesn't care about pride. So I swallowed my words. "If that's what you think is best," I said softly. It felt like surrendering a part of my soul. A few weeks later, I was moved into Sunny Meadows, a place with long, sterile hallways that smelled of antiseptic and bland food. My room was small, with a window that looked out onto a modest garden, but it didn't feel like home. There was no wooden box filled with my children's letters, no corner where I brewed my morning coffee, no trace of the life I'd built. The nurses were kind. They called me Mr. Thompson and made sure I took my pills on time. But my children were different. Michael was the one who brought me in. I'll visit often, he'd promised. Sarah sent a bouquet with a card that read, "Wishing you a speedy recovery." David called from San Francisco, grinning on video chat. "Nice place, Dad. I'm slammed right now, but I'll fly in soon." But the first week passed and no one came. The second week, Sarah stopped by briefly. She kept glancing at her watch. "Sorry, Dad, I've got a meeting to run to. Hope you're doing okay," Michael called. Once asked how, I was then shifted to the real reason I wired the payment for this month's fees. "But things are tight at the office right now." David sent a text. "You doing all right, Dad? I'm closing a big deal. We'll check in soon." I lay in bed that night, staring out the window at the garden, and felt something settle inside me, cold and sharp. The truth, the brutal, undressed truth. The sacrifices I made were returning now as ghosts, each one whispering what I didn't want to believe. I remembered when Michael turned 20 and I sold the land passed down from my grandfather so he could buy his first home. "I'll never forget this, Dad," he'd said. When Sarah got into art school, I worked late nights, blistered my hands on rusted tools so she could chase her dream. She once hugged me tight, crying, "You're my superhero." And David, I borrowed from everyone I could, skipped meals, cut corners just to send him abroad. Now they visited when it was convenient. Now they called only to confirm payments. Where did the gratitude go? What happened to the love I built this family on day by day, dollar by dollar, drop of sweat by drop of sweat? The pressure in my chest wasn't just from the heart condition. It was something else, something deeper, something heavier. Abandonment. The other old men here told stories too. Some cried when talking about the children who never came, and I found myself wondering, am I one of them now? One grey afternoon, sitting alone in the garden, I made up my mind. I called an old friend, my lawyer from back in the day. "I'd like to review my estate," I said quietly, "and take another look at my will." My voice was calm, but inside me a storm was rising. The days at Sunny Meadows moved slowly, as if time itself wanted me to sit still and reflect on a life already lived. Most mornings I sat by the window watching the golden leaves drift down into the little garden outside, and my mind wandered to memories my children never knew. Back when Mary was still alive, we used to talk about what we'd do if we ever had extra to spare. If life's ever kind to us, she once said we should help those who have it harder. After she passed, I kept that promise quietly, without fanfare. Maybe it was my way of keeping her close. I set up a small charity fund. No name, no recognition, built from the meager savings I scraped together over decades of hard labor. Each month, I'd put aside a few $100s, sometimes just a few 20s, and send them to people in need, a family who'd lost their home in a fire, a single mother struggling to buy formula, a young boy who needed school books. I never put my name on the envelopes. I never wanted praise. To me, it was just what a person ought to do, like fixing a leaky pipe so life could keep flowing. Sometimes I'd smile remembering the thank you letters that came to my old mailbox, unsigned heartfelt notes with trembling handwriting. Thank you to the kind soul who helped us get through. One winter I bought a coat for an old homeless man downtown. He held my hand, shivering eyes glassy with gratitude. "You're an angel," he said. I shook my head. "I'm just a regular guy." Now, in the sterile quiet of this nursing home, those memories burn like a small fire in my chest, keeping me warm when the silence creeps in. Over the years, I helped hundreds. Not with much, but sometimes a little is enough to change a day or a life. My children never knew. They only saw an old plumber with calloused hands and outdated clothes, not realizing the money I gave away came from skipped meals, worn-out shirts, and long nights fixing broken things for other people's comfort. One morning I was wheeling myself outside for a breath of fresh air when a woman approached me. Middle-aged, bundled in a worn coat, hair pulled back tight. Something in her face was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked, voice trembling. I nodded, curious. "I'm Lisa. 10 years ago, you helped me pay my rent when I was about to be evicted. Because of you, I had enough time to find a job, to raise my daughter." Her words stopped me cold. I hadn't thought of that donation in years. It was just a check I sent through the fund, never expecting to meet the person it reached. Lisa's eyes welled up. She squeezed my hand. "My daughter's in college now, Mr. Thompson. I don't know what would have happened without you." My throat tightened. I managed a smile. "I'm just glad you're okay," I said, but inside something stirred, an ache and a question I hadn't dared ask. She went on, telling me about others from the neighborhood, kids who got medicine elders whose roofs were fixed, before winter families who found their footing because of a nameless man they called the quiet hero. I shook my head, but her words struck something deep. My whole life I'd given everything to my children. And now, sitting in this place with its pale walls and whispering halls, I found myself wondering, were they ever worthy of the sacrifices I made? The pain in my chest started to pulse again, dull but insistent, a reminder that time was running out. That night, sitting alone in my room, I opened the old notebook where I'd kept track of every dollar, sent every story behind each act of giving. Page after page, names and moments stacked up like a ledger of quiet humanity. And I knew I had to do something to make sure these sacrifices wouldn't disappear, not into silence, not again. That afternoon, I was still holding my old notebook, fingers trembling as I turned its yellowed pages, when there came a knock at the door. The nurse opened it, and in walked my 3 children. Michael came in first, his face drawn and tired. Sarah followed, clutching a designer handbag, and David, freshly landed from San Francisco, barely glanced up from his phone, as if the business world couldn't spare him for even this. "Dad, we came to visit," Michael said with forced cheer, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. They gathered around my bed, asked a few polite questions about my health, but it didn't take long for the conversation to shift to what they really came for. "Dad," Michael began, his voice dipping into something hushed conspiratorial, "we should probably talk about your estate. My company's expanding and, well, keeping you here, it's not exactly cheap." Sarah jumped in, nodding quickly. "She's right, Dad. My husband and I are buying a new house, and this place costs thousands every month. If there's anything you plan to leave behind, maybe we could divide it now to make sure you're taken care of." Even David, usually the quiet one, added, "I agree. I'm about to invest in a major venture. If I had my share of the inheritance, I could grow it and then support you even more." They started arguing about how to split things. Michael insisted he deserved the largest portion because he was the eldest. Sarah demanded fairness, claiming she had looked after me the most, though her care amounted to a few rushed visits and missed calls. David said it should go by financial need, since his company had the most potential. They spoke eagerly, as if I were already gone, as if my life, my home, my everything had been reduced to numbers on paper. I lay still, listening. My chest tightened. Dad's becoming a financial burden. I heard Michael whisper to Sarah, not realizing I could hear. If he weren't around, things would be so much easier. Sarah sighed. "Yeah. Between the nursing home and the meds, it's exhausting." Their words cut through me like knives, but I didn't speak. I just looked at them, these children I had worked myself to the bone for, children I had lifted out of struggle with my bare hands, who now saw me not as a father, but as a bill to be paid. They stayed less than an hour before rushing out again, promising they'd return soon. I knew they wouldn't. When the door closed behind them, I sat up and clutched the notebook to my chest. The memories of every letter, every donation, every quiet kindness I'd offered through my small anonymous charity came flooding back. Those moments were real. Those people had been grateful. They hadn't expected anything from me, but what I gave made a difference. And now that work, that legacy, was the only part of me worth preserving. That night I called my old lawyer, a man I hadn't spoken to in years. My voice was steady. "I need to amend my will," I said. "Everything I own, every last dollar, goes to my charity fund." He was surprised, but I was sure. This wasn't revenge. It was justice for those who truly needed help, for the man I'd chosen to be. for the sacrifices I'd made with no regrets. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of calm, cold and steady like steel in the bones. The ache in my chest was still there, but it no longer frightened me. I picked up the phone and called Joe Peterson, my old friend from the plumbing shop days, now a semi-retired attorney. "Henry," he said, worry thick in his voice, "you don't sound like yourself. You okay?" "I'm fine, Joe, but I need to see you. It's important." I arranged for Joe to meet me at the nursing home that afternoon. I asked him to bring paperwork and that old beat-up laptop I'd kept around to track my bank accounts and records. Joe arrived just past noon, holding a stack of folders and wearing a look that said he already suspected what this was about. We found a quiet corner in the lounge where sunlight streamed through the windows and lit up the worn skin of my hands. "You want to change your will?" Joe asked, pushing his glasses up his forehead. "What's going on, Henry?" I didn't answer right away. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out the old notebook, my ledger of giving. 30 years of handwritten records, every donation, every name, every dollar that had quietly left my account to help someone in need. "I want everything to go to my charity fund, Joe. Not a cent to my kids." Joe sat back stunned, but I began to speak. I told him about the long days and longer nights, 16-hour shifts, skipping lunches to save for Michael's tuition, selling the land my grandfather once tilled just so Michael could buy his first home, mortgaging the house to send David overseas, freezing my fingers under broken pipes in Spokane's harsh winters just to afford art school for Sarah. Every dollar I had ever made, scraped together through sweat and sacrifice, amounted to $320,000, not counting the interest and small investments I'd made in my later years. Of that, $180,000 had already gone into the anonymous community fund I'd set up, quietly helping hundreds of children without books, families without roofs, elders without heat. I didn't do it for recognition, I told Joe, voice steady. I did it because it was the right thing to do, but I won't let my children treat me like a walking ATM. They called me a burden, Joe, a liability. I want my legacy to go to people who saw me as a human being, not a wallet. Joe nodded, lips pressed tight. He opened the folders and began revising the documents. The original will had divided my estate equally among the three of them, but the new draft contained just one line that mattered. All remaining assets, including property savings and investments, shall be transferred to the Spokane Community Relief Fund to assist low-income families and children in need. My hand trembled slightly as I signed it, but my heart felt strangely light. "Are you sure?" Henry Joe asked one last time. "Never been surer," I said, eyes drifting toward the window where a small bird had landed on a bare branch, fragile but free. "I asked Joe to keep everything confidential. Let them find out after I'm gone," I said quietly. He nodded and packed away the documents, then took my hand in his. "You're a good man, Henry. I hope someday your children understand that." I smiled, but said nothing. In my mind, I imagined the day they'd hear the will read aloud, the day they'd realize I wasn't the out-of-touch old man they had dismissed, but someone who lived by quiet conviction. Still, this wasn't revenge. I didn't do it to hurt them. I did it because legacy should mean something, and mine would go to those who truly valued it. I placed the old notebook back in the drawer, closed my eyes, and waited for a day only I knew was coming, carrying a truth only I had chosen to write. In the days that followed the signing of the new will, my health began to fade swiftly, steadily. The chest pains returned with more frequency now, like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Breathing became a struggle. I spent most of the day in bed. The doctors at the nursing home adjusted my medication, their voices lined with concern. "Mr. Thompson, you need complete rest," they said gently. I nodded, offering them a tired smile. But I already knew my time was winding down. I lay there beneath the sterile white ceiling, thinking back over the life I'd lived. The rainy mornings beneath Spokane's grey skies, turning wrenches with stiff, aching fingers. The bland meals and worn-out clothes sacrifices made quietly to save every penny for my children. And now this room, these soft beeping machines, this quiet wait for the final chapter. My children still called, but the calls felt more like obligation than affection. Michael rang once a week, voice clipped and distracted. "Hey Dad, you hanging in there? Work's been insane. I'll stop by when I get a free moment." Sarah texted more than she called. Her messages were curt, transactional. "Did you take your meds? I'm buried in a new project. My husband sends his regards." David from California would sometimes pop up on video chat. "You look tired, Dad. I've got a major deal coming up. Soon as it's done, I'll fly out." They checked in, but I could hear the undercurrent in their voices, the weary politeness, the quiet calculation, as if they were no longer asking how I was, but rather how long I had left. No one stayed the night. No one brought me the soup I liked or asked what I needed. Only quick calls, quick exits, each one leaving the room colder than before. In the rare, lucid hours I had left, I decided to write them a letter, a real one in my own hand. A final message. I pulled a notepad from the drawer and began to write slowly, my hand trembling with every line. "My dear children, I'm writing this because I know my time is short. I've given everything I had to raise you, sold land, so Michael could buy his homeworked night shifts, so Sarah could chase her dream, borrowed every dime I could to send David across the ocean. I did it all without regret, and I'm proud of who you've become. But somewhere along the way, gratitude faded. You called me a burden. You quarreled over my estate while I was still breathing. So I've changed my will. Everything I own will go to the charity fund I've quietly built over the years, a fund that has helped hundreds of struggling families. This isn't punishment. It's purpose. I want what I leave behind to matter, not be picked apart like scraps. I love you. I always have. But love, like respect, needs to be returned. Live well. And remember, family is not built on money. It's built on care. I folded the letter, sealed it, and gave it to Joe, my old friend and lawyer. "Give this to them after I'm gone," I said softly. When it was done, I felt lighter, as if I had finally laid down a burden I'd been carrying for years. I lay there quietly waiting, knowing the final moment was near. The climax of this long, quiet life. The moment my children would have to reckon, not just with what I had done, but with who I truly was. Another wave of pain came. This time deeper, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I smiled, thinking of the strangers I had helped, the lives I had touched, and with that warmth in my heart, I closed my eyes in peace. The day came sooner than I expected. It was a soft spring morning in Spokane, the kind where sunlight slips gently through the cracks in the blinds. I passed in my sleep quietly, peacefully. No drama, no final words. Just an old, tired man reaching the end of his road. The nurse was the first to find me. She called my children. The rest unfolded like a formality. Michael flew in from the city. Sarah drove from Seattle. David postponed a business trip to be there. They arranged a simple funeral at the small church near my old neighborhood. No lavish flowers, no throngs of mourners. Just a handful of faces from the plumbing shop, a few old neighbors. Dad lived simply. Michael told the pastor, "It's only right the service be the same," but I knew the truth. They didn't want to spend more than they had to. Their minds were already turning toward the will. The funeral came and went, brief and efficient. A familiar hymn, a short prayer. Michael delivered the eulogy in a flat, rehearsed tone. Dad was a wonderful father who sacrificed his whole life for us. Sarah shed a few tears, dabbing at them with a monogrammed handkerchief. David stood stiffly, glancing at his watch. No one mentioned the nights I spent under crawl spaces in the freezing rain. No one spoke of the loans, the labor, or the meals I skipped so they could eat better. After the service, they gathered at Michael's home, the same home I once helped him buy, under the guise of a family meeting. In truth, they were waiting for Joe. They sat around the long dining table, steam rising from their coffee cups, but the room held no grief, only tension, the kind of tension that hums beneath closed-door negotiations. I wonder what Dad left behind. Sarah said, her voice laced with anticipation. He must have had a good savings account. Probably sold that old piece of land too. Michael nodded, lifting his mug. As the oldest, I should get the biggest share. Dad always said he was proud of me. He'd want me to grow the business. David shot back, tone sharp. That's ridiculous. My tech company needs the capital. He paid for me to study abroad. He knew I'd build something big. The discussion turned heated. Sarah claimed she deserved more because she'd been there for Dad, conveniently forgetting those few hurried visits and half-hearted texts. Michael insisted the nursing home bills had come from his pocket, thousands every month. David brought up the loan I'd given him to expand his company. If he gives everything to one of us, it's completely unfair. Sarah snapped, her voice rising. Michael slammed his hand on the table. Dad wasn't stupid. He'd split it evenly. But I should manage the estate. None of you know how to handle money. What was meant to be a moment of remembrance had dissolved into a strategy session calculating transactional hollow. They didn't know Joe was on his way, briefcase in hand, carrying not only the revised will, but the letter I wrote in my own shaking hand. They argued on voices rising, eyes gleaming with imagined dollar signs, completely unaware that everything they believed they were entitled to was already gone. When Joe Peterson stepped into Michael's living room carrying his weathered leather briefcase, the shouting stopped cold. The air moments earlier, thick with argument, fell into a charged silence. My children turned to him with a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed impatience, like children waiting to tear into Christmas presents. "Thank you for waiting," Joe said, his voice low, and even as he took a seat at the head of the table. He opened the briefcase carefully, pulling out a single-folded legal document. His eyes swept across the room before he began. "I'm Joe Peterson, attorney for the late Henry Thompson. At Mr. Thompson's request, I'll now read his final will and testament." Michael leaned back, smiling with quiet confidence. "I'm sure Dad split it evenly between the three of us, right?" Uncle Joe, Sarah nodded, lips pressed together, and David took a sip of coffee, eyes gleaming with expectation. Joe cleared his throat and began, voice steady and deliberate. "I, Henry Thompson, being of sound mind, declare this to be my final will, dated—" He paused briefly. "I hereby leave the entirety of my estate, including savings totaling approximately $320,000, my home in Spokane, and all remaining assets and investments to the Spokane Community Relief Fund. The purpose of this gift is to aid low-income families, struggling children, and those in need of a helping hand. No inheritance shall be left to my children, Michael, Sarah, and David, except for the memories we shared and the lessons I've passed on." The room fell deathly silent, as if someone had sucked all the air from it. Michael was the first to break. "Wait, what? You must have misread that. Dad wouldn't leave us out. He couldn't." Sarah shot to her feet, face flushed. "That has to be a mistake, a typo or something. We're his children." David slammed his mug on the table, hands trembling. "No, no way. Dad saved that money for us, not strangers. What kind of sick joke is this?" Jojo shook his head calmly. "There's no mistake. Your father signed this will in my presence. He was clear, direct, and unwavering. These were his wishes." The tension in the room detonated like a fuse finally meeting flame. Michael shouted, "He must have lost his mind. We paid for his care, his funeral, now what? My business needs that capital." Sarah's tears spilled over more fury than grief. She turned on her brothers. "This is your fault. If we'd just visited him more, he wouldn't have done this." David stood and began pacing, voice rising in pitch. "A charity. He didn't have that kind of money for charity. This is fraud. He must have been coerced. We'll contest it. We have to. He wasn't thinking straight." Their voices tangled into a chorus of blame, denial, and desperation. Accusations flew, tempers boiled, grief and greed fought for dominance. And through it all, Joe sat quietly, patient, composed, knowing full well that the storm had only just begun. Because tucked safely inside his briefcase was the letter I left behind, the one that would tell them everything. Joe Peterson sat quietly amid the storm of voices, waiting until the shouting dulled into a tense hum. When the moment came, he spoke evenly, like a man holding something far heavier than paper. "This was your father's final wish," he said. "But he also left behind a letter for the three of you." He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope, passing it to Michael. They tore it open hastily, eyes racing across the handwritten lines, and then silence. Rage drained into confusion. "He said we were ungrateful." Michael snapped, fists clenched around the letter. "He gave up his life for us, and now he claims we called him a burden." Sarah sobbed, voice cracking as she threw the letter onto the table. "This can't be real. He must have misunderstood. We're his children, not strangers." David's hands trembled around his coffee mug. "This isn't over. We need to fight this. We'll prove he wasn't in the right state of mind." Within hours, they were in motion. Michael retained a high-end law firm in Spokane, filing a formal challenge to the will, claiming emotional instability and diminished capacity. Sarah hired a retired detective, Frank, a former police investigator, to dig through my past bank accounts, financial records, any sign of coercion or secret beneficiaries. "Find out where the rest of the money went," she told him. "Someone manipulated him." David called in favors from business contacts, hoping to dig up something, anything to suggest fraud. They met nightly around the table in Michael's kitchen, no longer discussing grief or remembrance, but legal strategy and tactics. Retainers were signed, fees piled up. "There's no way he gave it all to charity," Michael growled during one meeting. "That money belonged to us." But the truth buried for decades began to surface. Frank traced the trail of my account's modest deposits over years, consistent withdrawals of a few $100s each month, going to small non-profits and individual recipients through an unnamed charitable fund. He returned one evening with a thick folder, setting it on Michael's table. "Your father didn't hide money," Frank said, voice heavy with something between awe and quiet rebuke. "He gave it away." He laid out receipts, $2,000 to a family who lost their home in a fire back in 2010. Tuition for underprivileged kids in the rundown districts of Spokane. Winter coats for the homeless. Prescription medication for single mothers. Quiet generosity, no glory. Sarah flipped through the pages, stunned. "He really did all this," she whispered. "Why didn't he ever tell us?" Michael shook his head, clinging to doubt. "Maybe it was to avoid taxes. There's still a legal angle. We can still challenge this." But Frank wasn't finished. In an old box retrieved from my former house, he found my notebook, the one I used to record every gift, every name, every reason. There were hundreds of entries. A mother with a sick child, $500. A homeless man needing a coat, $200. A young student needing textbooks. A grieving widow short on rent. Line after line, page after page, $180,000 in total, given quietly, consistently, without a word. Frank set the notebook down and looked them squarely in the eyes. He didn't stash money away. He spent it helping people for 30 years, never asked for thanks, never told a soul. David's face went pale, but why cut us out completely? No one had an answer. They sat there surrounded by the evidence of a life they never fully understood. Documents, bank slips, scrawled notes in my own handwriting. It was all real, all deliberate, and all done without them. They still clung to the lawsuit because pride dies harder than love. But something had shifted. Regret crept in, quiet and cold, a feeling none of them wanted to name. For the first time, they realized my sacrifices hadn't ended with them. My life had been bigger than they ever knew, and the real reckoning was only just beginning. The documents on the table had stunned them into silence for a moment, but Michael was the first to shake it off. His voice was sharp with denial. "We're still going forward with the lawsuit. This whole charity thing, Dad was misled. We'll prove it." They hired another law firm, assembled paperwork, and began building their case. But word of my passing and the contested will had started to spread. It trickled through old friends, through Frank the private investigator, who had shared parts of what he'd found with a few people along the way. The story of Henry Thompson, the quiet plumber who left everything to charity, began to circulate. A few days later, as they were gathered around the kitchen table, reviewing legal strategy, Michael's phone rang. It was the pastor from the church. "Michael, I thought you should know. We've had hundreds of people call about your father. They want to attend a memorial. They say he was their benefactor. Would you be open to holding a larger service?" Stunned, they agreed, expecting maybe a few more guests than the original modest funeral. They hastily arranged a memorial at the same small church. But on that spring afternoon, when the doors opened, the wave of people that poured in overwhelmed them. Hundreds. They came in coats patched with wear, in work uniforms, in hand-me-down dresses. Families from Spokane's poorest neighborhoods, children holding wildflowers, elderly men and women walking with canes. The church swelled beyond capacity. It became a sea of unfamiliar faces, and my 3 children stood in the corner, pale and speechless. Who are all these people?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet murmurs. A young mother with a toddler in her arms was the first to speak. She stepped up to the pulpit and cleared her throat. 8 years ago, Mr. Thompson sent money for my daughter's medication. He never gave his name, but I found him. He saved my child's life. Next came an older man, his voice rough with age. He bought me a coat when I was homeless one winter. Then he helped me get a job. He told me everyone deserves a second chance. Then a boy, maybe 19, with trembling hands and tears in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson paid my tuition so I wouldn't have to drop out. I'm in college now, because of him." One after another they came forward. Stories poured out like rain. A roof repaired after a storm. Baby formula for a struggling single mother. School books, groceries, no-interest loans for a food cart. A heating bill paid just in time. Most never knew his name. They had simply called him the quiet hero, but after hearing about the will and the lawsuit, they came to honor the man who had changed their lives. Michael sank into a pew, hand over his mouth. "Dad, did he really do all this?" Sarah wept openly, burying her face in her hands. "Why didn't he ever tell us? We thought he had nothing." David stood frozen, staring at the steady stream of mourners still arriving. All these people. Dad helped them, and we didn't see it. They sat in stunned silence as wave after wave of voices rose up, recounting acts of kindness, bought with skipped meals, backbreaking shifts, and the land I once swore I'd never sell. The twist struck like a bomb, not an anonymous donation, not a legal technicality, but the collective weight of hundreds of changed lives, each one proof of a man whose true wealth was his compassion. It was too late for them to say thank you, too late to understand the father they thought they knew. My legacy wasn't in bank accounts or property deeds, it was in the hearts of those I lifted up without ever asking for praise. The church echoed with tears and gratitude as my children sat among the crowd, small, silent and shaken, drowning in the sound of everything they had missed. The memorial ended in hushed voices and quiet embraces, but for Michael, Sarah and David, it felt like a waking nightmare that refused to end. They left the church in silence, their faces pale, still echoing with the stories of the strangers their father had touched. Back at Michael's home, they sat around the dining table, no one speaking, the weight of the day settling like fog. Joe Peterson followed them in somber and steady. He placed a sealed envelope gently on the table. "Mr. Thompson asked me to give this to you after the memorial," he said softly. "I think he wanted you to understand." Michael picked it up, hands trembling, and carefully opened it. He read aloud, voice cracking. "My dear children, I'm writing this knowing my time is short. I sold the family land so Michael could buy his first home. I worked night shifts so Sarah could attend art school. I borrowed every penny I could so David could study abroad. I was proud of each of you, but where were you when I needed you? You called me a burden. You argued over my estate while I was still breathing. I heard it all. So I've left everything to the community fund I've quietly supported for decades, where my help was valued. This is not punishment, it is legacy. I love you, but love needs to be nurtured. Live better than I did, and remember, family isn't built on inheritance, it's built on care. The room went still, the air heavy with silence. Sarah broke first, her voice a whisper through sobs. He heard us, all of it. I didn't mean it. I was just busy. God, why did I say those things? She buried her face in her hands. He paid my tuition. I told him I'd repay him, and then I just forgot. Michael lowered his head, voice thick with guilt. I was the oldest. I should have taken care of him, but all I cared about was the company, the next deal. He gave us everything, and I called him a burden. I failed him. David, usually the most composed, sank into his chair, eyes rimmed red. I thought checking in once a week was enough. I thought he was fine, but he was out there saving lives, and I was just asking for money. I don't even know who I am anymore. The shame came fast and sharp, but still somewhere beneath it, greed stirred. Michael wiped his eyes and spoke through clenched teeth. We can still fix this. Call the foundation. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. They called immediately. Sarah spoke to the director of the Spokane Community Relief Fund, her voice desperate. Please, return the inheritance. It's family money. My father, he must have been confused. But the answer was calm, unwavering. The will is legal, final. Mr. Thompson supported us for over 30 years. He helped save countless lives. We're honoring his wishes. We can't undo that. They tried everything. Hired more lawyers, sent formal letters, pleaded, threatened, but every attempt collapsed. The documents were airtight. The decision was irreversible. With each failure, the regret grew deeper. Sarah wept alone, whispering to no one he gave to strangers because we didn't deserve him. I remember him making coffee every morning, and now I realize I never said thank you. Michael slammed a fist on the table. I called him old-fashioned, but he was a hero. Why did it take me this long to see? David stared out the window, hollow-eyed. I was too busy chasing success to remember where I came from. Do you think he forgave us? They held one another and cried not just for what was lost, but for what was never given in return. For the time they wasted, for the father they only now too late had come to understand. The inheritance was never about the money. It was about the chance to love him while he was still here. And that chance was gone. The regret now etched into their bones would follow them for the rest of their lives. In the months following the memorial and the failure of every attempt to reclaim the inheritance, Michael, Sarah, and David's lives changed irrevocably. The court dismissed their lawsuit. The Spokane Community Relief Fund officially received everything $320,000 in savings. The modest house I once lived in, now converted into a neighborhood support center, and every remaining asset. My children walked away with nothing, not a single dollar. Michael had to downsize his construction business. He laid off employees, sold one of his luxury cars, and for the first time in years found himself doing manual labor, patching drywall, fixing fences, taking small jobs just to keep the lights on. Late at night, lying awake beside his wife, he whispered, I used to think Dad was just stuck in the past. Now I know what it means to live without a safety net. He began to understand that success was never built on luck alone. Sarah's life unraveled too. After a bitter divorce over finances, she lost her high-rise condo in Seattle and moved into a modest rental on the edge of town. Her design clients thinned out, and she scraped by on inconsistent freelance work. Alone in her apartment, she stared at her old sketchbooks, remembering the tuition checks I sent without ever asking for thanks. I missed my chance, she confessed to a friend through tears. I never told him how much he gave me. She slowly learned to stretch every dollar, to live with intention, and to honor what had been sacrificed for her dreams. David's tech startup nearly collapsed from a lack of funding. He sold his shares, swallowed his pride, and took a job working under someone else, no longer the boss, no longer the prodigy. One night, sitting across from his siblings, he said softly, I used to ask Dad for investment money, but he gave up meals to save for us. I never saw it, not until now. He began reading books on financial responsibility, living with less, and started over with a different measure of success. Through struggle, they learned a hard truth: their father's sacrifices weren't meant to fund entitlement, but to build character. Slowly, they began to meet more often, not to talk about money, but to share memories of cold morning breakfasts and quiet advice, of a man who had little but gave more than they ever realized. But it was Sarah who changed the most. One afternoon, she returned to Sunny Meadows, the nursing home I once called home, not to complain, not to seek closure, but to give back. "I want to help," she told the staff. And she did reading books to lonely residents, brewing coffee for the widowed and forgotten, donating small portions of her own income to buy toys for children in need. Dad taught me something she later said to Michael and David during one of their family dinners. Her eyes shimmered, not with grief, but with quiet hope. Family isn't just about blood. It's about what we choose to give to others. They were no longer wealthy in the way they once defined it, but in the depth of their hearts, in the humility they earned, and the love they finally understood. They were richer than they'd ever been, and that at last was their inheritance. In time, Michael, Sarah, and David found new meaning in their lives, not through the inheritance they lost, but through the hard-earned lessons they could no longer ignore. Michael transformed his construction company into a job training hub for struggling workers' people he once dismissed as being beneath him, much like he had once viewed me. My father taught me that working with your hands isn't something to be ashamed of. He told his crew one morning, his palms now calloused like mine once were worn from honest labor. Sarah continued volunteering at Sunny Meadows. She opened a free art class for underprivileged children, using her skills as a designer to bring color and warmth into the stark rooms of the nursing home. "I used to think my father was outdated," she told one of the elderly residents as they admired a newly painted mural, "but now I see he was leading the way." David, shaped by his business failures, started a small foundation to help young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. In every mentorship session, he shared the same story. "My father skipped meals so I could study overseas. Now I'm doing what he did, giving someone else a chance." The true legacy I left behind wasn't the $320,000 now funding school scholarships, home repairs, and hot meals for families across Spokane. It was the lives that changed because of it, lives of strangers I once helped quietly, and the lives of my children who now live with gratitude and purpose. Stories about me spread far beyond the memorial. Local newspapers picked them up, then online blogs. Then a YouTube video sharing my letter, and life story went viral, millions of views. People called me the quiet hero. They shared tales of kindness I'd nearly forgotten, turning them into reminders that family isn't just blood, it's built through care, through humility, through love, expressed in the smallest of ways. My final message, written in that worn letter and reflected in the life I lived, was simple. I chose to help strangers rather than feed the greed of my own children. Because real family is where kindness is returned, not with money, but with sincerity. And now at last my children understand. Their lives are not wealthy by the world's measure, but they are richer than ever, with compassion, with meaning, with the kind of inheritance no dollar can buy. Thank you for listening to this story. I wish you health, happiness, and a family built not just on blood, but on love. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your own in the comments below, because kindness is the one thing that grows the more we give it away.